Good evening and welcome to this, our third episode of season 2 of the Non-Existent Story. I am Casey and I'm joined here by the luscious and lively Hannah, who has brought us two tales of dot dot dot.
Good evening, and my focus for my excerpts for this week's episode will be the intersecting point between psychology and science fiction.
Ooh, so psych fiction?
If you
Sci-fi?
will.
Can we call it sci-fi?
We can call it sci-fi.
Okay, I like that.
Okay.
Like
Excerpt
neologism.
1. Once up, Wilder's face was crotch level to the man across the train car. He didn't like the view, but train commutes were invariably faster for Wilder than walking. He couldn't drive in this world of is. A baby cried. Comfortable enough, he sipped his coffee and pretended, like the other commuters, not to notice the baby, or its loudly shushing mother, or Wilder's own crotch. His penis bulged obviously under his slacks like a giant rubber dreidel, pushing past his knees and slumping towards the floor. In Wilder's fantasy world, that is, the world of if and not is, jungles grew from skyscrapers, and he had only to gather a vine in his hands to swing from building to building. The only time of day was twilight, and the only kind of coffee was dark roast Colombian, and currency operated on a barter system of objects that only started with vowels. "Excuse me," said the woman with the baby, "can I sit here?" Wilder dragged his massive hand off the adjacent seat. It thumped onto the floor. His thin shoulder torqued from the strain. "Thank you," he nodded. Operating in the world of if simplified a lot of things for Wilder. He had fewer evolutionary advantages in is. Only one, in fact, came to mind: his lips, of similar size and shape to a Venus flytrap. They smacked so loudly when he ate. They had become a source of personal delight. Unfortunately, his tongue was far too large for it to fit behind them, which prevented other things like legible speech or whistling. The woman's baby continued to cry. It had red hair and a red face. Besides that, it looked very much like Wilder. They were roughly the same size. Wilder wondered if it was an ugly baby or a pretty baby. Babies were born much larger in the world of if, but without eyes. Those did not develop until later. Other, more important senses developed first, and by the time eyes arrived, they were of little use. For this reason, there was almost no staring in the world of if. Or, if there were, and if they did, it was from heads as bulbous and domed, and from eyes as vacant and blue as Wilder's own. The baby cooed at Wilder. The woman laughed. "Oh, now he's in a good mood. Do you like the nice man, sweetheart? I'm sorry he's just so cranky in the morning." Wilder shrugged, which caused his chin to bump his navel. "Oh, but he likes you. Yes, you like the nice man, don't you?" The baby burped and its eyes flared wide, clear whites around cornflower blue. Perhaps another traveler from if, Wilder considered, returning to his coffee. End.
That's really interesting. And I have questions and comments. But I'm ready for the next one.
Okay. I'll jump ahead then into excerpt 2. Billy had committed himself in the middle of his final year of the Ilium School of Optometry. Nobody else suspected that he was going crazy. Everybody else thought he looked fine and was acting fine. Now he was in the hospital. The doctors agreed he was going crazy. Assigned to the bed next to Billy's was a former infantry captain named Elliot Rosewater. Rosewater was sick and tired of being drunk all the time. It was Rosewater who introduced Billy to science fiction, and in particular to the writings of Kilgore Trout. Rosewater had a tremendous collection of science fiction paperbacks under his bed. He had brought them to the hospital in a steamer trunk. Kilgore Trout became Billy's favorite living author, and science fiction became the only sort of tales he could read. Rosewater was twice as smart as Billy, but he and Billy were dealing with a similar crisis in similar ways. There was a still life on Billy's bedside table. 2 pills, an ashtray with 3 lipstick-stained cigarettes in it, 1 cigarette still burning, and a glass of water. The cigarettes belonged to Billy's chain-smoking mother. She had sought the ladies' room. She would be back at any moment now. Billy covered his head with his blanket again. He always covered his head when his mother came to see him in the mental ward, always got much sicker until she went away. It wasn't that she was ugly or had bad breath or a bad personality. She was a perfectly nice, standard-issue, brown-haired white woman with a high school education. She upset Billy simply by being his mother. She made him feel embarrassed and ungrateful and weak because she had gone to so much trouble to give him life and to keep that life going, and Billy didn't really like life at all. Billy heard Elliot Rosewater come in and lie down. Rosewater's bed springs talked a lot about that. Rosewater was a big man, but not very powerful. He looked as though he might be made out of nose putty. And then Billy's mother came back from the ladies' room, sat down on a chair between Billy and Rosewater's bed. Rosewater greeted her with a melodious warmth, asked how she was today. He seemed delighted to hear that she was fine. He was experimenting with being ardently sympathetic with everybody he met. He thought that might make the world a slightly more pleasant place to live in. He called Billy's mother dear. He was experimenting with calling everybody dear. Someday, she promised Rosewater, I'm going to come in here, and Billy is going to uncover his head, and do you know what he's going to say? What's he going to say, dear? He's going to say, hello, Mom, and he's going to smile. He's going to say, gee, it's good to see you, Mom. How have you been? Today could be that day. Every night I pray. That's a good thing to do. People would be surprised if they knew how much in this world was due to prayers. You never said a truer word, dear. Does your mother come to see you often? My mother is dead, said Rosewater. So it goes. I'm sorry. At least she had a happy life as long as it lasted. That's a consolation anyway, yes. Billy's father is dead, you know, said Billy's mother. So it goes. A boy needs a father. And on it went, the duet between the dumb praying lady and the big hollow man, so full of loving echoes. He held a book he wanted to read, but he was much too polite to read and talk, too, easy as it was to give Billy's mother satisfactory answers. The book was Maniacs in the Fourth Dimension by Kilgore Trout. It was about people whose mental diseases couldn't be treated because the causes of their diseases were all in the fourth dimension, and three-dimensional earthling doctors couldn't see those causes at all or even imagine them. One thing Trout said that Rosewater liked very much was that there really were vampires and werewolves and goblins and angels and so on, but that they were all in the fourth dimension. So was William Blake, Rosewater's favorite poet, according to Trout. So were heaven and hell. And that is the end of excerpt 2.
Wow, this is a lot to work with. These are both like very, very, very concentrated excerpts or fragments. I guess this notion of psychological science fiction has to do with certain kinds of coping mechanisms that two people have who have found themselves or have found reality to be totally inadaptable. So what's kind of foregrounded in both is not so much that like, oh, they're such freaks, but although they kind of are, but rather that their freakishness is kind of like dependent or is a response to a really insufficient everyday life. And that insufficient everyday life, or like the triteness of it, the world of is, or the kind of artificial pleasantry of it, is in both cases kind of like embodied by this figure of the mother. So I was wondering what you think about this, like this maternity. In one case, Wilder's Wilder being on the train, and across from him, representing and embodying the world of is like the mother and the baby. And then the sort of triteness that Billy is increasingly detached from, that triteness is kind of also embodied by his mother and his problematic relationships with her. So what do you think maternity is doing in both of these?
I don't know so much that it would represent something reprehensible as maybe it's the last connection that people have
Mhm.
with what's holding them to reality, and for that very reason, it's kind of hated or pushed away. Because if it's your last tether, but you're not really wanting to be tethered, then you kind of make it into a caricature and push it away, I think.
Okay.
So it's the last connection, but it also becomes a very distorted one, I think.
And just yeah, because like the a sense of like origin and this sort of primitive, like the essential human bond is kind of represented then in the mother child, and so yeah, because it, as you said, it's like it becomes their tether. Um, so then that I was just struck by that. I mean, then to talk like more about um, yeah, the first one. So the it's interesting to me how like there's these moments of like intersection. Um, when as he's oscillating between his imaginary fantasy world, this is a world of Wilder's own creation, or is it borrowed from another source?
We don't know if it's a real world that Wilder has access to or if it's fantasy, I think.
Okay, but like it could be, all right, so it could be a real the terms of the story could be that there is a world of if, and like that's a reality within that fiction. They could be that it's someone else's idea and that Wilder was really, captivated by it, or it could just be a particular like I kind of thought of it as a coping mechanism. Like he's created this sort of this fantasy world that is realer to him, and it compensates in some ways for the insufficiency of the real world. But then what was interesting to me is how much the descriptions of his body were like made him impossible to actually picture. He's like this totally surreal being. Like, so it starts out with like the phallic area, and then there's this kind of like on the one hand, like, oh, something awkward, and like that would definitely not be a thing that you'd want to do in public, and versus like this hyper He-Man Tarzan thing and swinging on a vine. So like the phallic image kind of rotates. And like it becomes like a little revolving door that allows you to pass from like the awkward thing of getting a hard on in public as a grown man probably to being a macho Tarzan kind of apish figure. So he kind of does seem like a gorilla in many ways, in fact.
Yeah, but a very tiny one because
um,
he's almost the size of a baby.
he's almost the size of a baby, but he has giant hands and a fragile shoulder. He has he has these also kind of reminiscent of sexual organ lips, like the Venus flytrap lips, which is more of like a female genitalia kind of image that he smacks. So it's very, very like, but it's not obscene ever, which I found interesting. There's something kind of pathetically comical about it. And then when he shrugs, his nose almost touches his belly button, or his head almost
His
touches
chin.
his chin almost touches his belly button. So I was trying to picture this amorphous being, and he has like these big bulbous eyes, right, that are kind of vacant, and then like a domed head. So
Yeah.
does he look like what does he look like to you? How do you picture his?
Well, it's hard to get out of the excerpt that I chose, and maybe deliberately. But are you familiar with Humunculus?
A little bit, yeah. Yes.
So he is a Humunculus.
Okay. So like this is kind of, I think it's like a German concept, right? Of like the like original man. There's some German movie I saw where it's like the most like reduced kind of
Well,
mini
yeah,
man.
it started with the concept of in one semen you have a fully formed human being that's just very, very small.
Yeah.
And when the woman is impregnated, that being becomes larger. But
Right.
then that theory came with a whole, but that means that within every semen there's another semen that's a perfectly formed, and then with that there's another, and it goes on infinitely. But this is a very old concept that actually came into existence with alchemy. So in like the 14th century, 15th century.
Okay. I feel like,
But
go ahead.
the concept of the homunculus in psychology is actually associated with the motor and sensory mapping of the brain. So a very famous image is if you just looked at the parts of the brain that are devoted to different motor and sensory functions as a representation of what the human body would look like, it's completely distorted. And that distortion of the brain to the body is what they call a sensory or a motor homunculus. And it's this terrifying puppet-like image of this tiny creature with these massive hands that are like twice as large as the rest of the body, and then these tiny torso, and then a giant big toes, but the rest of their feet are very small, a small head and a massive mouth, and it's all directly correlated to brain mapping. So that's how modern psychology references the concept of the homunculus.
Interesting. So if it were actually like if the correspondences in the brain were actually like literalized into like size and proportions, it could look something like Wilder.
Yes.
So or
at least how Wilder believes himself to look.
Yeah. Okay. Because it could also be like a sort of highly distorted self-perception. That's really interesting. And then I think that this kind of like playful, almost like fairy tale world of is that is very, very simple. And its title works well to make, because you could just have this kind of like freakish description of this freakish being, and instead you have kind of like this plays of perception, and there's like a, I don't know, kind of like a playful fairy tale quality to it too that otherwise it wouldn't have. And then is the train a very important thing? Because it starts off with that. Like, he prefers the train because he doesn't like to drive. Is it because he can't drive?
Right, or he can't drive in the world of Is, probably because he would be too small to operate a vehicle, and he can't walk to work because it would take him too long because he's only like half a meter tall. So, I mean, if there was more, you'd be able to tell, but as it is, you're kind of operating on less. But yes, that's why he prefers to commute on the train.
Okay. Yeah, I would want to know, like, really, if he actually, if it would be interesting if the story could, over like a long period of time, maintain an ambiguity as to if he actually looks like that, because the mother is interacting with him as if he were anyone else. So it could entirely just be he's read too much psychology, and at one point he lost his reason. So then we have Billy. And I think what was interesting, were striking to me, and that was, I really liked the dialogue play back and forth that had like this Joycean quality almost to it. And his different kind of like modes of coping with things were not necessarily out of like insincerity. So he's like, I'm going to be really pleasant to everyone. It's not, and you can kind of see it as a sort of like kind of goodwill sense of desperation in that. And then the really hypersensitivity to certain details, I thought was you can kind of get this sense of like zooming in very, very sharply that seems to like suggest that he's also like kind of trying to hold on to something. But I mean, one has the sense in this one that the situation is not sustainable, that you're kind of like about to crash into something. Like, whereas like, I think like with Wilder, it just seems to be like, this is a state of being, and if for some reason it's maintained some sort of equilibrium where it oscillates, and it seems like it could kind of do that indefinitely. Whereas Billy's situation seems to not be sustainable for very, very long.
Yeah.
I don't know if you think that is true.
Well, with Billy, there's more of a feeling of desperation, and certainly more a presence of or hinted at suicidal ideation. So that combined with kind of his dynamic with Elliot Rosewater, who's the one having the conversation with the mother in the end, and then his kind of pushing away of his hiding under a blanket, when his mother visits him in the hospital. It seems like this cannot continue. That something is going to happen for the better or the worse, but it will be only one of those two things.
And what's the name of the author of the it's Maniacs in the Fourth Dimension?
Maniacs in the Fourth Dimension
Okay.
by Kilgore Trout.
Kilgore Trout. Would Kilgore Trout be a character at some point, hypothetically, in the story, or really in this story? I don't know how to ask this question.
Well, I would certainly hope so, because he sounds fascinating.
I know, right? Like, you feel like you'd want an encounter, because it seems like some of the it's interesting because like the in as opposed to like the Don Quixote tradition where like the books in the fantasy world are kind of what like lose someone to cause someone to lose their grips with reality. In this case, like he already has lost it and he's just he finds an explanation for it in this book, like some, which is I guess what we find in a lot of books actually, is like, oh, that's my neuroses. So I get that. But it would like, it feels like an encounter. Either he would just commit suicide, or it, you know, things would just get very, very dark, which they're not, because of this kind of funny like detachment that you get that keeps it kind of humorous. Or he would have some encounter with the author or with the book that could possibly like change his understanding of like what's going on. So I don't know. Do you think like the book could pose some sort of like restorative? Or like, does the book have more to do with like helping or harming his kind of suicidal ideation?
Well, I don't know if I could address it as in helping or harming, but definitely the appeal with these two excerpts and these two stories is that dynamic between psychological illness and the genre of science fiction. So yeah, they talk about the science, like a science fiction writer, but that's not necessarily a rejection of his concepts as true or false necessarily.
Right.
He just has a more objective tone with Billy versus with the other story with Wilder. It's more, there's less of a delineation between what is necessarily reality and what is probably not. Outside of his head.
Okay. Yeah, no, I feel like the reader of science fiction as a character it seems to be somehow different sometimes from other kinds of readers. Well, I'm going to guess.
Okay.
Should I justify it or should I just say it and then you can tell me and then I'll.
It's totally up to you. I usually just guess first in case my justification is wrong. I don't embarrass myself. But if you're confident.
No, I'm not. But I feel like the dialogue and the tone of the dialogue suggests to me that you wrote the second one.
Which one did I read second?
The second one is Billy.
Okay. I wrote the first one.
Really? Oh my God, no, I got one wrong.
Yeah. But
right,
yeah, but yay me because Kurt Vonnegut wrote the second one. That was Slaughterhouse 5.
Is it really?
Mm-hmm.
I haven't read the book in a really long time, apparently, because I don't remember that at all.
Yeah. No, I got the idea of it, actually, I think from a previous conversation that we had talking about Kurt Vonnegut. But yeah, that's pulled from Slaughterhouse 5.
I do remember there's the troglodytes from, or I think that's what he calls them, from there's a fourth dimensional character.
Yeah, like Trilformidians or something.
Yeah, something like that. Wow, so the first one's due. That's really good.
Thank you.
I'm impressed.
Thank you. Well, I just thought that I'll have to post an image of the sensory homunculus. I thought it was the most terrifying and kind of cool thing at the same time. And it seemed to lend itself to science fiction.
It certainly does. And I feel like I've come across this concept in like a different context, but I'm trying to remember, there's a German movie that I've seen in which the homunculus is a character, but in its alchemical state. It has to do with like, I think that's why I associate it with Germany. I think it has to do with like some, what's that?
Classically, it's just tiny people.
Yeah, no, this is like a sort of like, it was like a fetal sort of thing, but it also had like a human face, but I'll have to look up the movie and then we can talk about it or whatever. Because it had a kind of monstrous character, not just like a mini me sort of thing to it. So wow, man, I'm shamed. I'm hardly ashamed of myself that I did not recognize an excerpt from Slaughterhouse 5, which we had talked about. And even when you described in detail the mappings of psychology and how that should have been a clue, but I was like, oh, frankly, I thought it was just too good for you to write it.
Oh, well,
that was my mistake. I underestimated you. Which seldom happens actually. But yeah, so it's really good, and I think you should write it like as a
well, I'm glad you like it. In between, I kept being afraid I was towing the line between weird and is this kid, what's the deal with, I feel uncomfortable when an excerpt this short has like massive penis and sitting next to baby kind of involved. but that was not what I was going for.
I mean, I don't think the baby would really be that threatened. I think they're probably the least threatened of any demographic by giant penises on trains. Well, yeah, no. That was also kind of another thing, is that you don't usually go phallic.
I know. I had to come up with something different. It took a phallic turn for the word.
But you know, it's quite elegant, and I think it's I don't know that it works really well as a shorter piece. I don't think you'd want it to be like a novel or anything.
I don't think I would work because you have to it only pulls it off because there's so much ambiguity in it, and you can only keep that up for so long unless you're delving into the more magic realism, which I wasn't. I wanted this to be like, is this real science fiction or is this all in this dude's head? So I don't think I could do that long term.
Yeah, no, and it's kind of like a portrait. I think it's really quite good. I think you could like try publishing it somewhere. But that's just my biased take, because if it was good enough to fool me, it must be brilliant.
Must be.
This is how I'll save face. So embarrassing. But how was did you read Vonnegut and then get this? Because that seems unlikely. I feel like you would have worked the other way around for this one.
No, I had, well, I'd originally I wasn't even going to reference Kurt Vonnegut. There was another short story that I wanted to reference because I wanted a contrast between originally dissociation. So people who disassociate with their own bodies, but not in the sense of like eating disorder or see certain flaws amplified within their own bodies, but completely disconnect and attribute their own appearances in a totally different way, but are kind of objectified from it, which is a thing. And I'd read one short story about it, which I thought was very good, but I couldn't find it anywhere. So I had to think, well, what other sci-fi kind of psychological stories are there? And Kurt Vonnegut immediately came to mind. And I was thinking originally of referencing Galapagos, because he does that in that novel as well. But more recently than reading Galapagos, I had read Slaughterhouse 5 actually when I was visiting friends in Ohio. So I thought that also worked kind of well. But I had to edit out a lot of little parts that were clues, which I thought you would get. Like, it talks a bit more about them feeling suicidal because of his experience in Dresden and seeing the firebombing. And I was like, no.
Dresden would have given it away. Yeah. But yeah, apparently, yeah, I haven't read that in a really long time. So
I was a little sneaky about my I will say it was selective excerpt. I took a bits and pieces out here and there.
I like that. I like the intersection though. I think they're genres that make sense to bring together. I don't know. Cody showed me this. It's kind of a parody of a podcast. It's a parody of a podcast done by like a typical nerd podcast, in which they just talk about how awesome something is. In this case, Star Wars. So it presents you this room with these three guys, and they all have their like Star Wars t-shirts or whatever. and behind them is every ridiculous like merchandising that you can imagine. And next to this one guy's head, there's hanging down like one of those little spaceships. I don't remember, and it keeps like swinging slightly in the breeze, it's like poking him in the eye every time he turns, and he never moves to stop it. He just keeps doing it the whole time. So they just talk about basically it's like this empty fanboy talk where they just kind of gush over the Rogue Legacy or whatever the new Star Wars is. But the point in this kind of like long-winded thing is it's very funny, and I definitely recommend it. Is that the line between really liking certain science fiction books and being insane is not always entirely firm.
It's not clear, and there's a whole other discussion between, I mean, what is versus isn't a healthy relationship with reality.
Yeah, or with
or what is it isn't crazy, or fantasy.
Yeah. I mean, I think usually the idea is things that are like a work that questions some of the values or the legitimacy of so-called normality is usually where it's interesting. So I think the only thing that I would maybe like do differently in the Wilder one is that you might want to flesh out just a little bit the woman and baby characters so they don't seem just like parodies of like 50s housewives, you know what I mean?
Yeah. No,
So otherwise
if
the
we're like
world
to
of
make it
is
into a
is
short
too
story, I would definitely
yeah.
try to make
Yeah,
it.
no, obviously it's fine for now because the emphasis is overwhelmingly on the language that is used to. Yeah, the detail with the lips is really good, and the description indirectly through like certain gestures so that you have to piece it together. Like it's like really. Did it take you a while?
It took me a few hours. Yeah, but mostly because I'm a slow writer, so I'll write like a paragraph and then I'll read over it 7 or 8 times and I'll rework it before I move on to the next one, which apparently you're not supposed to do, but that's how I write. Bad habit.
I think you should do that. I wish more people would. Based on my experience reading a lot of people's writing, which is what I do. Well, this was great. And I'm very excited for you to put them on our website because you're not very good at that.
Yeah. Well, no, I had to figure out that I have to, for some reason with this computer, I have to use a very particular browser in order to upload anything onto WordPress.com.
Oh, weird. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we have more followers on the website for some reason.
Really?
I got like 6 random likes from random people. So our audience is growing.
Oh, 6?
Yeah.
That's more than 2.
I know, and I don't
it
even
can't just be you and me.
I know, right? No, they're like people in like other countries and stuff too. So I don't know. The WordPress community. But anyway, well, this was fascinating, and I'm looking forward to seeing what illustration you choose.
Me too.
For these, perhaps you'll end up like illustrating it yourself. But yeah, so yeah. Homunculus itself is a great topic for.
Yeah, I got really excited when I was reading into it. I was like, man, I could go on about the homunculus idea, or the cortex man is the, I guess, technical term for. There's some strange images, definitely.
I bet this is not well. Did you ever read the Rat Man, Freud's case study?
No, I didn't. I kind of loathe Freud, but that's a conversation for another time.
Yes. Yes. It's a conversation that we've had before, so maybe we don't have to have it online. Yeah, but that's fair enough. All right. Well, then I'm going to sign us off then. So this was delightful. The titles, obviously Slaughterhouse 5 is one of them.
Slaughterhouse 5, and for the one I wrote, it's gonna either be just homunculus or commute of the cortex man.
Commute of the cortex man.
Yeah. Or something.
I don't think either. I don't like either of those.
I don't like either.
Yeah. I think homunculus gives it away. Mm-hmm. You should have to deduce that. And commute of the cortex man makes it sound too B-movie-ish.
But it's science fiction.
Yeah, but is it? I think you just do World of If or something like that.
World of If.
World of Is for World of Is or something. I don't know. One of the understated ones. Venus Flytrap.
Vagina face man.
And sorry, we're gonna end on that.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.